Ethan's first steps into the alien palace were like stepping into a dream that had been stitched together from half-remembered science fiction movies and the occasional fevered imagination of an overcaffeinated human mind. The walls shimmered as if liquid metal had been frozen mid-motion, and the floors subtly shifted beneath his boots, responding to weight and mood, he was told, though he suspected it had more to do with showing off alien engineering than any practical function. He kept his hands awkwardly folded behind his back, trying not to brush against the walls and risk activating a hidden mechanism that might either politely greet him or vaporize him entirely. Already, the first minor disaster had occurred when he misjudged the spacing of a floating platform and nearly fell into a hovering fountain that didn't appear in any map he had received. "Graceful as always," he muttered to himself, catching the edge of a levitating railing. The railing didn't care. It remained inflexibly elegant and entirely judgmental. Lyra, the Queen's daughter, appeared from a side corridor at that moment, and the effect was nothing short of arresting. She looked almost human in shape, but the long, delicate sweep of her ears, extending like ethereal ribbons from her head, immediately marked her as something otherworldly. Her hair shimmered in waves of color that seemed to respond to her moods, though whether that was natural or enhanced by palace technology, Ethan had no idea. She approached with a calm, measured stride, each step a quiet assertion of both elegance and authority. Ethan, who had been rehearsing a million ways to appear intelligent and competent, instead felt the blood drain from his face and his mouth go dry. "Ethan," she said, her voice melodic, carrying a subtle undertone that hinted at amusement. "You've managed to survive the entrance without dismantling half the hall. That's impressive." He attempted a bow but misjudged the gravity modulation underfoot and ended up in a wobble that looked like a cross between a human greeting and a failed breakdance move. Lyra's lips curved into a grin, and Ethan seized the moment to make a joke, the only thing he could think of in panic. "I like to arrive with style, even if gravity disagrees." She chuckled lightly, the sound melodic and unexpected, and it sent a tiny jolt of confidence through him. The reception hall was a riot of colors and alien technology, with attendants whose forms seemed almost translucent, some floating in midair as if defying convention, others carrying trays of luminous liquids that pulsed with an internal rhythm. Ethan's first attempt at taking a sip ended in disaster. He picked up a cup that had been magnetically suspended and somehow managed to misalign it, causing the liquid to hover above the cup like a stubborn jelly refusing to be tamed. The attendant glared, the cup quivered, and Ethan could only freeze in place, imagining interstellar diplomacy collapsing due to his lack of coordination. Lyra, watching quietly, bit her lip to suppress a laugh, and for a moment the tension eased as he realized she wasn't angry. She was entertained. The Queen herself appeared shortly after, a towering figure of presence and authority. Her skin gleamed faintly under the palace lights, and her eyes, vast and luminous, seemed to see into layers of thought Ethan had hoped remained private. She observed him with an expression that was impossible to read, somewhere between curiosity, suspicion, and perhaps mild amusement. "Ethan," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "I've noticed you maintain a certain distance from my daughter." Ethan swallowed and tried to formulate a reply that would convey politeness, humor, and competence all at once. "Ah, well, Your Majesty," he said, stumbling over the formalities. "I suppose I'm careful. I mean, Lyra is exceptional, and I'm just a human, prone to mistakes, spilling drinks, accidentally initiating palace defense drones." His words tumbled over each other in a chaotic but earnest attempt at honesty. The Queen raised an eyebrow, one that somehow managed to be both intimidating and inquisitive. "Palace defense drones?" she asked, and the faintest hint of amusement flickered in her expression. Ethan nodded vigorously, imagining in his mind the tiny hovering machines circling him like overzealous mosquitoes, which, in truth, had happened just last week when he had accidentally pressed a panel he didn't understand. Lyra stepped closer, her long ears twitching subtly, as if she were listening to something beyond the range of human perception. "He's telling the truth," she said, her voice teasing but not unkind. He nearly activated 3 security drones just by trying to complement the crystal chandelier. She smirked at him. Ethan, relieved that she wasn't offended, offered a weak grin in return, only to misstep slightly and catch himself on the side of a floating platform. The Queen's scrutiny remained intense, yet Ethan found himself noticing the delicate details of her attire, the way her garments seemed to hover and flow independently, responding to her movements like liquid silk infused with subtle energy fields. It made him want to comment, but instead he opted for silence, letting his clumsy charm speak through action rather than words. "Why avoid her, then?" the Queen asked, leaning just slightly forward. There was no malice in her tone, only curiosity and expectation. Ethan's mind raced. He could tell her the truth, but what kind of truth would she understand? And how could he deliver it without sounding foolish, without accidentally insulting Lyra or undermining interstellar protocol? "I respect her," he said finally, his voice quieter than intended. "I admire her, and maybe I didn't want to overstep before I knew how to exist in her world properly." He paused, realizing he sounded more like a philosopher than a guest at a palace reception. "Also, I have a tendency to trigger security drones." For a long moment, the Queen simply regarded him, her luminous eyes considering, measuring, weighing. Then, slowly, she allowed herself a faint smile, the kind that made the air shift and the room feel slightly warmer. Humor had softened the tension, and sincerity had intrigued her. Lyra, observing, tilted her head and laughed quietly, the sound light and melodic, echoing slightly in the hall as if the palace itself approved of this fragile bridge being built. Ethan straightened, feeling the beginnings of something unprecedented, a connection, however tenuous, between a human and an alien royal family, built on honesty, humor, and the kind of awkward charm that only humans seemed capable of producing. And somewhere above, a tiny security drone, sensing the shift in mood, hovered idly, as if bored and considering taking a nap. By the end of the evening, Ethan had survived without incident, mostly, though he had spilled exactly 1 drink, mispronounced 4 ceremonial phrases, and caused a minor but harmless disturbance among the floating attendants. Yet he felt human, in a place that defied human logic and perhaps, just perhaps, on the cusp of understanding alien elegance in a way that was entirely unexpected. Ethan followed the Queen through a corridor that seemed to shift subtly as they walked, the walls breathing faintly like living metal, adjusting their angles and light to the pace and mood of those who passed. He kept his hands folded in front of him, trying not to trip over the ever so slightly levitating floor panels, which seemed to take personal offense at human clumsiness. Lyra had excused herself politely with a teasing glance that left him wondering if he was being watched or judged from multiple dimensions at once. The Queen, for her part, moved with effortless grace, her robes flowing as if pulled by invisible currents, each step leaving a faint ripple in the floor that shimmered and then settled. "Ethan," she said, her voice even but carrying a weight that made him straighten involuntarily, "I want to understand why you keep your distance from Lyra. It is not merely a matter of etiquette. Carries implications." He nodded, trying not to look like a human about to confess a minor crime, when in fact he felt it might be the same. "Well, Your Majesty," he began carefully, "it's complicated, partly because, well, Lyra is extraordinary. I mean, you can see it in the way she carries herself, in how she handles everything. And me? I tend to make a mess of things." He gestured vaguely at the palace walls, as if acknowledging that these walls might remember his earlier missteps. The Queen's eyes glimmered faintly, not unkindly. "Messes can be forgiven. I am more interested in intention and understanding. Humor and honesty may be your defense, but they are also revealing." Ethan's mind spun. Honesty revealing things? That was dangerous territory. Still, he tried. "I suppose I was trying to respect her. Not in a boring, bow and scrape way, but I didn't want to overstep. Humans have a tendency to," he flailed briefly with his hands, "mess up alien protocols. Like the time I accidentally activated the gravity modulation in one of the guest rooms." Guests were floating for 20 minutes. People laughed, but I was terrified. The queen's lips curved in a tiny, restrained smile. Floating humans. Amusing. I would have observed that. I am pleased you survived without permanent damage. Ethan laughed nervously. I survived, mostly. The chandelier did not. He paused, realizing he had once again invoked chaos instead of grace. Well, minor chaos. Hardly interstellar incident material. The queen's eyes softened, though the intensity remained. You show courage in admitting flaws and humor in navigating them. These are traits worthy of attention. Yet your reticence is curious. You are not naturally timid. Why hesitate with her? Ethan considered. He could have said admiration, but that sounded both poetic and suspicious. He could have said fear, but that sounded weak. Instead, he tried the truth in his awkward human fashion. Lyra, she's a warrior scholar, a mind and body in perfect synchronization with her environment. She doesn't just exist. She commands. I respect that. I didn't want to intrude or appear foolish. And sometimes, he added with a grin, I worry I might inadvertently trigger one of your palace's minor security measures, or a drone, or accidentally challenge her to a zero-gravity duel without realizing it. The queen's eyes sparkled with something like amusement, and she inclined her head slightly. You are honest, and oddly self-deprecating. Do you consider this courage or folly? Probably a little of both, Ethan admitted, trying not to imagine being jettisoned into an airlock for answering incorrectly. I do try to survive most encounters intact, though, especially in places with levitating floors and self-righting chairs. They entered a chamber that hovered faintly above the main palace floors, tethered by energy filaments that pulsed with a soft rhythm. Plants floated freely in microgravity, their roots curling and twisting in patterns that defied human logic. Ethan nearly stumbled on a filament, earning a quiet snort from the queen. He realized that, for the first time, she allowed herself a small moment of amusement at his awkwardness. See, he said, pointing at himself with a sheepish smile. I almost managed a dignified entrance. Almost. One misstep and... He gestured at the floating greenery, imagining being flung into a zero-gravity orchid. The queen leaned slightly closer, her voice gentle. Your humility does not mask your intelligence. Ethan, you weigh your actions. You observe. You are aware of consequences. This pleases me. Ethan blinked. I'm aware of consequences? He repeated, then laughed. Well, mostly. Sometimes the consequences sneak up on me. Like the time a wine glass learned to hover on its own and followed me around like a jealous cat. I'm not proud, but it was impressive. The queen's amusement deepened, though she maintained her composed exterior. You are unconventional, but that is not unwelcome. Lyra has never encountered a human quite like you. Perhaps that is the reason for your distance. Not fear, but prudence and recognition of her presence. Ethan nodded, feeling a rare surge of relief. He hadn't been flustered into diplomatic disaster, at least not yet, and it seemed the queen understood more than he had dared hope. Presence, yes, he said. She has it. All humans, myself included, tend to either overreact or underreact when confronted with people like her. I aim for something in between, preferably without initiating any palace-wide emergencies. The queen's lips curved in a subtle, approving smile. You are human, predictable only in your unpredictability. That is acceptable. Ethan grinned, letting the tension slip slightly. Acceptable is good. I can work with acceptable. Mostly, provided nothing floats at me unexpectedly. For the first time, the queen allowed a faint laugh, soft and musical, filling the chamber in a way that made the floating plants sway lightly, as if participating in her amusement. Ethan realized that humor, honesty, and just a touch of human clumsiness had not only kept him alive, but had begun to create a fragile bridge of trust between species. Lyra appeared quietly in the chamber doorway, her long ears twitching with curiosity, and Ethan, despite his usual awkwardness, felt a sense of balance settle over the interaction. He had been honest, he had been humorous, and he had survived intact. Perhaps more importantly, the Queen had begun to see him not as a foolish human, but as someone capable of understanding and respecting the complexities of her daughter's world. As he stood there, glancing at Lyra, he felt the faint thrill of possibility, the sort of possibility that stretched across worlds, species, and conventions. And somewhere, in the softly pulsing energy filaments above, a tiny drone hovered lazily, observing him with what Ethan could only interpret as either suspicion or mild approval. The grand dining hall of the alien palace shimmered with lights that shifted like liquid stars, casting iridescent reflections across the floating tables and hovering platters. Ethan entered carefully, mindful of the low-gravity zones that made each step feel like a minor leap, as if he were walking through air thickened with liquid crystal. Lyra was already there, poised at the head of a table that curved in a perfect arc, her long ears twitching in a rhythm that seemed attuned to the hum of the hall itself. She looked at him with a faintly teasing smile, the sort that suggested she was both amused and curious to see how he would manage in what could easily become a ceremonial disaster. "You've survived my mother's chambers," she said lightly, her tone both warm and challenging. "Do you think you can survive dinner?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I have survived floors that tried to eat me, floating plants, and one overzealous security drone. I'd say my odds are reasonable, though the platters look slightly sentient. That worries me more than the floors." Lyra laughed, the sound melodic and resonant, echoing softly against the walls. It was a sound that made Ethan realize just how little he understood of alien social norms and yet how entirely capable he was of enjoying them. They moved through the first course carefully, each dish a marvel of alien cuisine. Liquids that shifted flavors as they moved across the tongue, crystalline fruits that hummed faintly, and aromatic gases that made him sneeze involuntarily, drawing an amused glance from Lyra. Then came the ceremonial games, a custom of the palace intended to test wit, adaptability, and the subtle dynamics of diplomacy. Ethan was paired with Lyra, and the first game involved navigating a shifting platform maze suspended above the hall, a challenge that required both intellect and an intuitive understanding of the artificial gravity fields. He misstepped once and ended up briefly stuck in a low-gravity corner, spinning lazily as Lyra extended a hand, her fingers brushing his in a gesture that was both practical and intimate. "You're awkward," she said, though the smile in her eyes was genuine. "I expected more grace from a human." "I offer style in moments of chaos," Ethan replied, twisting back onto a stable platform. "It's my signature approach." They moved together through the maze, Ethan gradually understanding that Lyra's laughter and teasing were as much a test as the maze itself. He began to notice patterns in her movements, subtle cues that hinted at her thinking, and for the first time, he approached a challenge not just as a human in an alien world but as someone who could anticipate, respect, and even compliment her actions. At the end of the games, the Queen watched them quietly, her luminous eyes following every gesture, every word, every misstep. Ethan realized she was not merely judging him but observing how trust and understanding could form between species, how humor could ease tension, and how honesty, even when clumsy, could create bonds stronger than any formal alliance. Later, the Queen asked him directly, her tone calm but expectant. "Why do you avoid Lyra?" Ethan paused, then answered simply and sincerely, "Because I respect her. Not just for her status or abilities, but for who she is. I didn't want to assume, overstep, or treat her as something she isn't. I wanted to understand, to meet her where she is, not where I think she should be. And I suppose I wanted her to see me as human, entirely flawed, entirely honest, and hopefully not entirely foolish." The Queen's expression shifted slowly, the tension in her posture softening. Her long ears twitched slightly, a subtle indication of her approval. "Your answer is unexpected. Yet it demonstrates clarity, restraint, and courage. You see her as an individual, not a tool or symbol. That pleases me." Lyra, watching him with wide, curious eyes, leaned forward and touched his hand briefly. "That's more than anyone has ever said," she murmured, her voice carrying a warmth that was entirely human, entirely sincere, and entirely disarming. Ethan exhaled, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over him. He realized he had changed during this journey. From a man intimidated by the unknown, cautious to the point of hesitation, to someone capable of navigating alien cultures, bridging gaps with humor, honesty, and genuine understanding. He had learned to adapt without losing himself, to respect without shrinking, and to connect without overreaching. The final moments of the dinner were lighthearted. Ethan accidentally knocked over a floating utensil, which spun gracefully through the air before landing perfectly on a table with Lyra's help. They both laughed, and the Queen allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Even the hovering drones seemed to relax, their movements less precise, almost playful. By the time the evening ended, bonds had been formed. Trust, respect, and something more delicate, threaded through with humor and sincerity. Ethan left the hall knowing that the journey ahead would still be filled with challenges, cultural puzzles, and unexpected hazards. Yet he felt ready. Ready to meet the unknown with a mixture of human curiosity, courage, and charm. The Queen's eyes, the quiet approval of the palace, and Lyra's teasing warmth assured him that his presence mattered, that he could belong in a place that had once seemed entirely alien. And as he stepped into the softly glowing corridors, Ethan allowed himself a private, satisfied thought. If surviving one palace and a royal daughter required this much diplomacy, humor, and self-control, then perhaps humanity could manage the stars after all. The galaxy, he realized with a grin, might be just complicated enough for him to make it entertaining.